Well, good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. Well, welcome again to Economics Unbound. What a day of activity and intensity yesterday was in Cape Town as the Minister of Finance, Minister Tito Mboweni, mounted the podium to deliver the latest budget, Budget 2020, in an environment of high unemployment and depressed economic growth.
Welcome back, Tandeka. I watched with great interest and fear. Tans, I know that a grouping that is called the Budget Justice Coalition developed a submission that provides an overview of the key budgeting trends of the past 5 years. They were worried and they researched and analyzed trends in our budget, as they were seeing declining social spending with negative impact on society and service delivery.
Yes, Nana, the state and its institutions are increasingly unable to deliver basic services and social goods. So the group that made the submissions to the Finance Committee of Parliament analyzed the impact of 5 years of austerity budgets on two main elements of the social wage, and those are health and education.
I understand that the submission also focuses on Parliament's oversight role in relation to the budget, looking at how budget decisions have been made and provided recommendations to support greater and wider preparation by the public in the budget process.
Yes, Nana, and we were there to bring everyone the national public broadcast on the budget for radio, television and digital, in the interests of our mandate, of course, to give useful, meaningful but simple information that can lead to wider participation by the public in not just the budget process, but also in the economy as a whole.
While you finish tooting your own horn and hooter their Tans, I will tell the viewers that the economists and organizations that made the submissions to Parliament were concerned with what they controversially call the pursuit of regressive and counterproductive austerity policies that have become increasingly entrenched. The fact that the tax mix hasn't been shifted back from the unsustainably low path established by the growth, employment and redistribution policy during the Mbeki era, and they say that given the obligations of the state to maximize its available resources to fulfill the rights in the Constitution, the people and our municipalities are looking worse for wear and are poor in condition. In fact, sad, shabby shape, Tandeka.
The submission goes on to say that instead, the fuel levy and VAT increased, combined with social spending cuts, have been implemented to plug holes in the fiscus and to bail out captured and troubled state-owned enterprises, SOEs. They said that they believe that reshaping our current tax mix towards more tax justice, a better oversight of state expenditure, and an increased focus on fighting tax evasion and avoidance can relieve some of our burdens.
But the controversial issue is, do we have fiscal space, wiggle room, to be more expansionary and to improve our growth prospects by increasing public spending? You spoke to people outside Parliament. What did they say? Oh dear, I should just invite the listeners and viewers to take a look at this clip.
The minister has spoken to issues that bring about relief and stability to our own economy and was quite realistic. I mean, he could not have been honest in the manner that he was. The fact that he's now beginning to focus us on investment in the future to make sure that the future generations could be able to construct a country of their own dreams as well. One, that we're turning South Africa into a construction site. This is going to be very critical towards the creation of jobs.
The minister has made the right decision by prioritizing growth as his number one focus, and that's why there's been no tax increases and in fact a little bit of tax decreases for personal income tax. That's good news, that's pro-growth, and that's helpful to the economy. It's also good news that he's focusing on cutting the public wage bill. However, we must stress that those numbers still need to be negotiated with the public sector unions themselves, so we can't take them as a given.
We welcome the establishment of a state-owned bank, the Sovereign Wealth Fund. We also welcome the fact that the minister is trying to ensure that small business becomes the biggest beneficiary out of state spending. But we're disappointed that he has reduced the allocation of local government from 10% to 8.8, because majority of our people, when they refer to government, they refer to local government.
If you look at the deficit, the budget deficit is already 6.5%, and it can increase to 6.8%. If you look at the gross debt situation of the government, it increases to 356 trillion, which is about 65.8% of the GDP. That is quite worrying.
This budget is not pro-poor at all, but we appreciate the minister's honesty, because what he was doing was telling the country that our country is not at all in a good space, that our economy is not growing, which is very bad news for the mass unemployed.
There were a number of positives to take from the speech, as well as a number of negatives. Obviously, the positives that one does see is that there was no increase in personal taxes, no increase in VAT. But then on the negative side, we do see the budget deficit increasing to 6.8%, and of course, the government debt levels increasing significantly.
There's no growth strategy in that speech. It was a matter of the minister and his government trying to do damage control and managing this terrible situation the best they can. But from where we're sitting is that their priorities are a bit lopsided.
I think as South Africa, we don't have money to be creating a state bank. I think we should be much more focused on other things. This is not a priority for us now. What ought to be happening is, if we create development finances, there's already institutions that are available for that, the Land Bank and other banks. And what we should be doing is partnering with the private sector for the purposes of development and stimulating actual economic growth. That's what we need.
Women was not mentioned in the budget. I don't know if it was an oversight or what, but I assume so. Because remember, we know that the President in the State of the Nation address spoke about gender-based violence, the importance of it, top of the agenda, what needs to be done. So I was a bit disappointed.
Wow, Tandega. It appears an anti-austerity movement is rising in the country, and it cuts across different political formations. Who would have thought that previous rivals COSATU versus AMCU could work together? Or even COSATU Breakaway Federation, SAFTU, could march side by side with COSATU. Things are changing and politics are shifting in our country.
Yes, Nana, that's true. Unemployment remains one of the burning issues plaguing our country. Let's look at the reaction by unions to the latest budget. Zwelinzima Mabavi, SAFTU's General Secretary, and Mike Shingane, COSATU's first Deputy President's interview earlier this day.
They have decided to, in the overall, cut the budget by a whooping 261 billion rands. And in doing so, they announced that they are cutting the budget in relation to health, education, municipal infrastructure. They are suspending the transfers for the integrated transport system. They will not build the bus services in Bombela, in Buffalo City, in Sunduzi, and that they are then launching an attack on the public sector workers by cutting 162 billion rands from their wages. And as if that's not enough, they are now calling on the unions to come to the bargaining council, where they want to formally withdraw from an agreement that they have signed.
A country and a government that is supposed to be a developmental state such as ours cannot explain how you can cut expenditure on health. when we have got so much burden of diseases in this country. We cannot explain how you cut expenditure on education when you have got the skills the problem that is not responding to even the needs of the industry. You can say a lot of the things. It's not something to be celebrated while welcomed, the issue of cutting of the income tax. The working class has been overburdened over and over again for so many years. They've been overtaxed by that income tax, by VAT that was hiked, but also by the extremely high cost of fuel and transportation.
Now, according to our government, its latest tax proposals aim to resuscitate the country's ailing economy and encourage consumer spending. In the latest budget speech, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni unveiled a 2 billion rand tax relief surprise and changes to income personal tax brackets, which will benefit some low-income earners.
South Africans have been given a much-needed income tax relief. Government has opted not to increase personal income taxes on fears a further increment will harm the economy's recovery. Treasury has noted that it has announced large tax increases over the last 5 years. However, this has done little to close the widening tax revenue collection shortfall, largely due to subdued growth. As a result, government has introduced above-inflation increases in the different tax brackets, meaning South Africans could pay less taxes. Government has also increased the tax-free threshold from 79,000 rand to 83,100 rand.
To support growth, therefore, we propose no major tax increases. I don't know where people who talked about VAT increase got that from. Indeed, there is some real personal income relief. This budget means that a teacher who earns on average 460,000 rand a year will see their taxes reduced by nearly 3,400 rand a year.
While economists expected the value-added tax to increase by 1 percentage point, Treasury has left it unchanged at 15%. The general fuel levy will increase by 16 cents per litre, while the road accident fund levy will increase by 9 cents per litre come the 1st of April. Sin taxes are also set to increase. A box of 20 cigarettes will go up by 74 cents. Spirits by R2.89 per 750ml bottle, and malt beer by 8 cents per 340ml can. The carbon tax will also go up from 120 rand to 127 rand per tonne.
I think because no significant new taxes have been introduced and the minister's given some compensation for fiscal drag, that's, which is inflation, that's a big relief for the average household who have more money in their pockets to spend. And I think that does help in terms of helping to stimulate the economy.
The tax revenue shortfall currently sits at 63 billion rand, significantly higher than the proposed 52 billion rand in the medium-term budget policy statement. This is in part due to the rising unemployment rate and weak economic growth. However, government is hopeful that collections will improve as it continues with efforts to rebuild SARS.
We know we are underperforming, but tax revenue comes from three driving forces. The first is, in any given economy, there's tax policy. That's the level of tax that you pay, whether you're VAT or CIT or PIT or any of the other taxes. The second is the level of compliance in society. And the third is the capability of SARS to administer the laws. Now, one would be tempted every time when you need more revenue to raise taxes. But the more money we take out of the system, it in fact then begins to reverse the impact on the economy.
Government has also outlined plans to reduce the corporate income tax from 28% to attract investment and revive the economy. Mbalenhle Mthethwa, SABC News, Parliament.
And now to tackle more on the latest budget speech, we have Davy Root on the line. And he's a director and chief economist at Efficient Group. Good evening, Davy. How are you?
I am, well, I'm quite fine. Thank you very much. Good evening to you.
Your immediate reactions to the budget?
Well, my immediate reaction to the budget is that there were a couple of, quite a number of surprises that I'm really did not expect in the budget. The one surprise was that there were hardly any tax increases. I really expected the Minister of Finance to announce a number of tax increases. Another surprise in the budget is that the Minister of Finance is planning to cut back on state spending on a wage bill to the tune of about 160 billion rand. That was, in a way, a kind of a surprise. And then a surprise that wasn't really a surprise is that the Minister of Finance did not tell us where the money for Eskom is going to come from. So my first reaction to the budget is that the Minister of Finance is in need of money. So instead of getting money from the taxpayer, he decided to borrow more money. And that's my main concern, is that state debt has reached levels that are totally unsustainable at the moment.
Now, typically, austerity budgets have got the tax side, and then they've got the deep, mainly social spending cuts. He decided to go gentle on the tax and raising taxes, and he went deeper into cutting social spending. Why? What do you think informed these choices?
Yeah, let's just understand what this means. You mentioned the word austerity. The word austerity means that the state is spending less, the state is less expansionary, and economists, we call that fiscal policy. And that is certainly not the case. In fact, the state today, the fiscal deficit, now let me just explain this. The state spends an amount of money, and they take an amount of money out of the economy by way of the various taxes that we pay to the state. The difference today in South Africa is roughly equal to about 7% of GDP or 7% of the economy. So the state in South Africa today is hugely expansionary. That means it's hugely stimulatory to the South African economy. This is certainly not an austerity budget. This is anything but an austerity budget. This is a Minister of Finance that's spending far more money into the economy than it was getting out of the economy. And so I'm afraid to use the word to say this is an austere budget certainly is not the case. This is a highly expansionary fiscal budget. And that's the reason why we are in trouble the way that we are in, because the state has been spending so much more money that they've been getting in by way of the various taxes that the debt levels has reached levels now today that are totally unsustainable. And I think that's my main concern about the budget, is that the Minister of Finance needed to get more money. So instead of increasing taxes, which I'm not in favor of, but he decided to borrow more money. And in the process, the debt levels has reached levels the highest that it's ever been, and levels that has become totally unsustainable as well.
So what's your view on the stimulus package that was announced a few months ago?
This is not well, it has been quite stimulatory. Like I've just explained, is that the state is spending more money than what they're getting in by way of taxes, but in the process, the debt levels keeps on going up. And eventually, it's exactly the same as an individual. An individual can keep on spending money on a credit card, and eventually you take on a second credit card and you spend money on a second credit card, and eventually the bank manager is going to call you. But in the meantime, it's quite nice because you can buy a new flat-screen TV, you can buy a new car, you can buy new furniture, but the day is going to come when you need to repay these sort of things. And that's where we are today. The Minister of Finance did not decide to repay this debt of the furniture that we bought last year. He, in fact, bought a new flat-screen TV. That's the problem that we have in the country.
But of course, we know that domestic budgets cannot really properly be equated to national budgets. But I wanted to ask you, this kind of macroeconomic model that we are on, where we see a lot of attempts to constrain public spending, we tend to see that in other countries they go together with high unemployment. Can we afford these high levels of rising unemployment as an economy and as a country?
Okay, so I think the point you're trying to make, and I agree with that, is that we have very high levels of unemployment in South Africa. If we cut back on state spending, we will actually increase unemployment in South Africa, and that is absolutely correct. And that's the reason why we should have started consolidating the fiscal accounts many years ago. We did not do that. We simply decided to keep on spending money in an attempt and in a hope that the economy will keep on growing. Today we are in a position where state debt levels has reached such levels that we simply cannot keep on spending at the same rate. And today is going to be very, very painful if we want to turn around the state debt levels, which has increased to levels that are totally unsustainable. So I'm afraid the reality is, if we really want to stabilize the fiscal accounts, we have to cut back on state spending, and if we do that, it is going to lead to a short-term recession, but it's simply become inevitable in a current environment. So I'm afraid to say that we've had our chance. We simply did not make use of the opportunity the last couple of years, and now we are in a position where things are going to be getting even worse, simply because the state simply cannot afford these current levels of expenditure that we're currently having.
And what do you think the main creditors are going to think, and what do you think the ratings agencies will think?
Well, they've already told us what they think about this. Fitch, for example, one of the major rating agencies, they said this morning that the trajectory of the fiscal debt levels are totally unsustainable, exactly what I've just told you. And that tells me that they think that South Africa should be downgraded. Moody's, I believe, also made an announcement later this afternoon saying that the fiscal accounts has become totally unsustainable. So I'm afraid we're probably going to see a downgrade. In fact, we should have seen a downgrade long ago. If we do see a downgrade, it will lead to an outflow of capital out of South Africa, it will lead to a weaker currency, and it will lead to even weaker economic growth. I'm afraid this budget that we have, it's a budget that I think the Minister of Finance, what he should have done, he should have been far more aggressive in cutting back on state spending. The price would have been very difficult to pay in political terms, and it probably would have led to the economy going into a recession in the short term as well. But I'm afraid we've passed that level where the fiscal accounts has become sustainable. We simply owe too much money, and we simply cannot keep on going spending as much money as we have been doing the last couple of years. But the reality is the fiscal, or rather the rating agencies already mentioned that the fiscal accounts of South Africa has become totally unsustainable.
The last question is, David, do you believe that our economic policies are still rooted in liberal economics, and
No.
which would see sovereign debt as highly problematic?
You use the word liberal economics,
Yes.
and of course that's a loaded word. Is this a new liberal economic policies that we have in South Africa? The answer is without a doubt, certainly not. This is socialist policies that we have. We have a government that keeps on getting bigger and bigger. We have a government that keeps on spending more and more money. And we have a government that ran out of money, as simple as that. And in the process, they've accumulated more and more debt. And eventually, a bank manager is going to call you, and we passed that level already. So no, this is certainly not liberal macroeconomic policy. This is socialist economic policies. And as Margaret Thatcher once said, eventually you will run out of other people's money. That's where we are today.
Thank you, Davi, for joining us, and thank you for sharing your views on the budget. That's what we have to conclude that interview right now. Thank you. Now, Nana, are you still there? Tell us who has got the latest news in Parliament.
Our senior macroeconomics reporter, Gloria Sifa Gomusi, prepared this report for us.
Now, Nana, let us listen to what our reporter Mbongeni Mutwa has gathered on the latest budget.
Termed the toughest budget since democracy, it paints a picture of an economy battling several headwinds. Economic growth is expected to remain below 1%. Government finances are under pressure on the back of the weak economic growth, low revenue collection, and rising debt levels. There are more demands leveled against the limited available resources. The government says debt will increase over the medium term, and that the increasing borrowing is not for building infrastructure, but to fund operations. debt servicing costs are growing fast. The government says to halt fiscal deterioration, it will strive to restrain spending while pushing for faster economic growth. Electricity shortages are expected to constrain growth over the next few years.
Government will, in quotes, do whatever it takes, unquote, to ensure a stable electricity supply. As I said, it is our #1 task. We have allocated 230 billion rand over the next 10 years to achieve the restructuring of the electricity sector.
The troubled state-owned companies continue to put pressure on government finances. Eskom relies on government support to operate. The troubled power utility continues to receive financial assistance, including 105 billion rand in financial years 2019, 2020 to 2021. Treasury says this is conditional to accountability and addressing inefficiencies. Government has set aside 16.4 billion rand over the medium term for SAA to repay guaranteed debt and cover debt servicing costs. Government says it's assessing its appetite to continue ownership of SA Express, which is now under involuntary business rescue. 576 million rand is allocated to Denel for this financial year to implement the turnaround plan. SABC will receive the remaining 1.1 billion rand by the end of next month. This tops the 2.1 billion rand earlier received by the public broadcaster. The risks to South Africa's credit rating have become more pronounced over the past year. Further downgrades of the credit rating could lead to higher borrowing costs.
If they downgrade us, the implications are huge. They will affect all of us. Borrowing costs are going to be high, not only for government, but also for companies that are interested in expanding their business activities.
Analysts say South Africa needs to speedily implement structural reforms, address policy uncertainty, and ensure stable electricity supply.
I think the most important one now is around electricity. So they reiterated again what came out of SONA, and they said, you know what, when it comes to the electricity sector, we're going to have to try to get electricity from sort of private outside of Eskom to get more generation. If they concentrate on that, I mean, they use the word urgent, and I think that's what they're going to have to concentrate on right now. And then the other structural reforms that came out from SONA, they're going to have to put in place, but the immediate one is what's going on with electricity.
The finance minister announced that the state bank announced by the president in the State of the Nation address will be a retail bank operating on commercial principles. He also says the Sovereign Wealth Fund will be formed with target capital of 30 billion rand, and that funding could come from the proceeds of spectrum allocation, sale of non-core assets, and petroleum, gas and mineral rights royalties. Joras Tefako Musi, SABC News, Parliament.
As usual, education gets the lion's share of the budget this year. The Basic Education Department gets 266 billion rand and Higher Education gets 119 billion rand. However, the allocation is 5 billion rand less than what was projected last year. Health spending goes up by 8 billion rand to 230 billion, but it's 4 billion rand short of initial estimates. Human Settlements has seen its budget decrease by 1 billion rand compared to last year. Spending will be reduced by more than 14 billion rand over the next 3 years, meaning less subsidy houses will be built. That, along with a 3 billion rand reduction in the municipal infrastructure grant, will see less provision of running water and electricity connections to poor households.
While some of these savings are good for the fiscus, in many cases, we're also making difficult and painful political sacrifices. It is therefore important that we direct our constrained resources to areas that have a high social impact and have the largest economic multipliers.
The Transport Department gets a 3 billion rand increase this year to 445 billion rand, but the municipal grant for transport infrastructure has been cut by 13 billion rand.
Over the 3 years, public transport spending is adjusted by 13.2 billion, mainly on allocations to the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa and the Public Transport Network Grant. The planning and implementation of the integrated public transport networks will consequently be suspended in Buffalo City, Mbombela, and Msunduzi municipalities.
The police service gets a modest increase of 1 billion rand this year, pushing its budget to 106 billion rand. The poor get a cushion, with the Department of Social Development getting 9 billion rand more than last year, taking its budget allocation up to 189 billion rand. That will see the old age grant go up by 80 rand to 1,860 rand a month. The disability grant also goes up by 80 rand to 1,860 rand a month. And the child support grant will increase by 20 rand to 445 rand a month. Then there was the much talked about reduction of the public sector wage bill. In an unexpected but positive move, Mboweni believes he can save 160 billion rand over the next 3 years without putting jobs on the line.
The employer has tabled an agenda item on the management of the public service wage bill at the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Council. The focus is to discuss and negotiate the containment of costs in the final phase of implementation of the current wage agreement. We aim to save 37.8 billion rand in the next financial year. There's more than one way in which this goal can be achieved. Organized labor understands where we are and share the pains of this government. They have made constructive proposals on a range of issues which need to be discussed and negotiated. We must be open to negotiations and discussions.
The success of the strategy depends on buy-in from public sector unions, meaning the stage is set for a tough bargaining season ahead. Mbongeni Muchwa, SABC News, Parliament.
Well, thank you to our colleague Mbongeni Muchwa as we welcome our guests, Daniel McLaren, Budget Analyst at Section 27, Russell Rensburg, Director of Rural Health Advocacy Project, and Isabel Fry, Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Welcome, dear guests. You're welcome at the SABC.
Thank you.
Now, let's do an establishing question. Briefly, your take on the budget, and then so on.
A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. I think it was a very interesting budget. You know, I think many of us weren't prepared for some of the bold and sometimes not so bold moves, but it was big on announcement but light on detail. So I think there's still a lot of things that need to be done in order to realize some of the savings or some of the directives that were announced in the budget. And you, Isabel?
I found it very interesting. Two writers on the budget. One labelled it an extremely austere budget, that was Duma Qubule, and the other, Miriam Altman, said it was definitely not an austerity budget. So it seems that there is a broad scope of interpretation. For me, the take-home was a sort of questioning in the decision on where the fiscal policy laid its burden. Having had a country decimated by an increase of 1% of VAT 2 years ago, we saw the relief going to income earners. And we know that from our unemployment figures and the poverty levels that you were referring to earlier, that's a very small portion and not necessarily where the relief should have been targeted.
Section 27.
Thanks. Yeah, well, we work in the health and education sectors, and we were quite taken aback by the scale of the cuts which are being applied to those sectors. Several billion rand. If you look at it for education, it's about 800 rand per learner next year. So we weren't expecting that level of cuts, even though funding has been progressively reduced in recent budgets for these areas. So quite taken aback.
What would be the effect of deep cuts in education and health?
Well, I mean, just to give you some examples, the education infrastructure grant was cut, about 450 million rand less for school infrastructure next year.
That means we can't eradicate pit toilets fast enough and mud structures in the schools.
Yeah.
What's the effect on the next generation of children that we are preparing to enter society and industry?
Well, you know, Tito Mbweni talked about the structural changes that need to happen in the economy. It was also mentioned in the SONA that we need to make structural changes. But health and education are critical aspects of the economy. And if we don't invest in them, if we are leaving people to be taught in classrooms which are too big, without enough teachers and in unsafe schools, and in a health sector where there's not enough medical professionals,
We are creating structural barriers to growth, not just now, but in future years and future generations even.
You'd like to jump in?
Yeah, no, I'd like to jump in because I think at the same time, like over the last 10 years, we've really eroded state capacity. And I think in many areas we have to probably ask ourselves some difficult questions. Does more money solve the problems? And do we
We've
solve
eroded state capacity, you say, and what do you think of the deeper cuts into the allocations to municipalities? Wouldn't that further erode the capacity of the state at the municipal level to actually deliver basic services?
Absolutely, but I think at the same time we have to start looking at where is it where we want to land, right? I think this whole notion around this current government that got elected in May last year was really about to introduce a series of reforms and change the way that the state operated its business. And we look at infrastructure spending, we've done terribly on the quality of our infrastructure spend, and in many ways it's been sort of like a way for corruption. We also can't, I mean, a lot of the cuts that are being announced right now are related around employees and sort of stabilizing the work, the labor budget. But I think we also have to start having a conversation of whether we have a fit-for-purpose service, whether the civil service in its current form can deliver on the broader objectives of improving the quality of life for all our people, rather than just looking at the effect on the civil service. When we look at health, when you look at the distribution of posts, one of the biggest challenges that we have is the way that we allocate spending for health. So health is both a national and a provincial competence. We know that of some of the things that happen in KZN and more recently in the Northwest and Limpopo, that sometimes our provinces don't allocate enough to healthcare. So when we look at I think we have an opportunity now to actually start looking at the way we spend and start having conversation of how we prioritize spending to those people most in need. Primary healthcare, for instance, has been underfunded by provinces through the equitable share consecutively for over 10 years. And in some places in the Eastern Cape, you probably have half the staff that you need. Then you look at a small province like Limpopo that spends 70% of their health budget on human resources for health, but yet have only half the healthcare workers that they need. So I think if we want to start charting a path forward, we can't pour new wine into old sacks. We have to start thinking about how can we use the money that we do have to actually improve services for those most in need. And I think that asks for us to have difficult conversations. And I think we need to be ready for those.
Isabel, if we bleed a lot of workers out of the public sector, and government is a huge employer, what will that do to myriads and millions of households across the country in terms of their ability to meet basic needs as households?
I think that's a really good question. And I was going to come in on what Russell was saying. Not only is the state the largest employer, it's also the largest spender. If we're cutting infrastructure and if we're cutting maintenance, as Daniel was referring to, then it also means we're going to bleed the entire economy from the build and from the inputs that go into that. So on the one hand, we have to be aware of the role that the state as purchaser plays, but also the state as employer. Given the high levels of unemployment and increasingly astronomically high levels of structural unemployment, which means that people once unemployed struggle to
We have the highest rate in the world.
73%. So basically once you're unemployed, you have very little hope of getting back in. And we know, as you and I have discussed before, there's no social security for working age people. Our social grants certainly were not increased in terms of reach, and the real value was not increased. So effectively what we're doing is...
In fact, there were cuts on the social grants received quite a deep cut.
So they were nominal increases, but real cuts. And if you look at the inflation rate, so what we're doing is we're starving literally millions of people from the ability to fend for themselves and certainly to be part and parcel of an active economy. I mean, Russell and I were talking off camera just about the fact that our economy is stagnating. There's no circulation because if you have 1 in 2 people living below a poverty line and 1 in 4 people not having enough money to survive, you're not having active members in the economy. And if you have a stagnating economy, you certainly are not going to get the capacity to grow. But I think critical, and this is one of the things that we at SPI, Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, are trying to say is we certainly don't go into the narrative of a failed state but we are saying that this is an abnormal situation we're in. The levels of poverty and unemployment are abnormal. We can't be using prescribed orthodoxies such as Davy Roth and other people come up with, which we've been trying to apply for the last 25 years. They come from a situation where the fundamentals to an economy are very, very different to ours. So we need to have the courage.
What do you mean ours?
South Africa. Basically the unemployment levels and the poverty levels, where the functioning people in the economy is an enclave on a sea of people who are excluded from that. So really what I would say is that we need to have the courage to start looking at doing things differently. So the introduction of a sovereign wealth fund, there's a whole big question as to where that's going to be capacitated from. But it shows that at some stage...
I think they said they would take 30 billion out of our 800 billion reserves and begin the fund.
And start seeding it there. Yeah, I'm looking at windfall taxes and things like that. But to me, it signals that the state is beginning to look at non-orthodox solutions. And I think that's a good signalling. I know that we're talking about the budget, but being involved with the Job Summit and the work around that, I would say that government also needs to be communicating its successes. They are good things that government is doing, but those are not the things that come forward. So instead, we're looking at sort of short-term cuts. So just on social security, I think that what we need to be saying in this abnormal situation in which we find ourselves is raise the borrowing, and let's look at a sort of 5-year ring-fence period in which we stimulate the economy through increased social spending.
What do you think about our government's debt tolerance?
Look, I mean, it has it has risen a lot in the last 9 years, but that was because we had the fallout of the global economic recession. We had to stimulate the economy at that point. The issue is since then, the spending has slowed down and the economy has slowed down with it. And as the spending has slowed down, leading eventually to this budget where there's been a cut, the kind of orthodox National Treasury assumption that the private sector would start to fill the gap that's been left by the private sector spending, it's just not translated. The private sector's continued to shed jobs.
I mean, private sector growth often follows public sector investment in the economy. But hold that thought as we go for a short break. Don't go away, dear viewer. Stay with us. Well, welcome back, and tonight we're having a discussion about the budget delivered by Tito Mboweni yesterday. I was saying during the break that it seems to me that the government and Treasury were seized with a very big crisis and were left with very few options. And you get a sense of an administration paddling away and trading water, you know, but you don't get a sense of the long-term vision. Where are they leading us to? Are we to take short-term pain for long-term benefit, or are we to clearly make bold steps in a particular direction? So I want you to each speak to me about economic leadership and the issue of a vision for this country, because we've had big visions in the NDP and so on, and most of those targets have been overshot.
Look, I think that health is more than disease. You know, so I think policies like the NHI have the potential to have a huge social impact, not just in the way that we deliver healthcare.
Positive impact?
Yeah, positive social impact. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that we face as a country is youth unemployment. And one of the most startling statistics that I looked at was youth between 18 and 24 who are not in employment or education and training. Over half of them don't even have matric. So the pathways to employment are very limited. So when you look at something like the National Health Insurance, for instance, where we make a big investment in building infrastructure.
While this may be important,
we can
I'm just hoping we can speak about overarching vision
so I think at the end of the day,
sectors.
For me, the overarching vision is to create employment for the structurally unemployed, because it's the biggest political and economic risk. If we don't address structural unemployment amongst the youth, 10 years from now, our political landscape might be very, very complicated. So what we need to do in terms of an overall economic vision is start looking at ways how the state, through social investments, can create pathways to employment to get the majority of unemployed people to participate in the economy. And I think one of the ways we can do that, and it's simple, is social infrastructure. So building a hospital in a rural area doesn't just create healthcare services for those rural communities who are predominantly under 35. It also creates pathways to employment. We can train plumbers, we can train electricians, we can train mechanics, and we can give people a pathway to skills that can liberate them economically and allow them to fully participate. And when we have more people participating within the economy and having access to good health care, our whole economy will grow. I think this top-down idea where we think that we can stimulate industry and expect the private sector to create jobs, I think we've kind of proved over the last 25 years that even when we had growth, during 2005, the 2000s, our growth went up as high as 7%. But that group was still structurally excluded. And I think we need to do a little bit better now in the next 25 years.
Section 27, speak to us about economic leadership and the obligation to lead the country in a way that's consistent with the vision of our Constitution, which envisages certain economic rights that should and ought to accrue to the bulk of our people.
Well, there you have your vision. You know, the Constitution does provide that kind of vision. And what we're lacking is leadership to reckon with what the Constitution actually requires. So the Constitution requires the substantive equality between people. So that means when you pass a budget, when you pass any law, you have to actually show that that what you're doing is going to reduce inequality. For example, what we're actually starting to look at now is Section 27 with other organizations and groups is whether these budget cuts are actually constitutional, whether they're actually legal. You know, there's an economic debate which we have to have about whether the economy is actually fit for purpose in terms of the Constitution, and whether it's actually delivering on people's rights.
So you would like to test whether these budgets, these various budgets where they introduce deep cuts to social spending can actually pass constitutional muster.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can look at a budget, and the Constitution actually gives us some really good guidelines for how we can do that. So there's the question that Russell was raising around the efficiency of expenditure. The Treasury and the Minister of Finance said that there's going to be expenditure reviews. There's been those in recent years, and that's great because we do need to figure out how we can spend money more efficiently. But the Constitution also says that we have to realize these rights progressively over time. And that means that making a cut to a right or reducing access to a service or slowing down the rollout of a service, there's quite a high bar that the Constitution requires the government to get over to show that that has been its absolute last resort. And while people might argue that the public debt has reached a level where it's being forced to make these cuts, we don't think that it's provided sufficient evidence for that. And we'd like to explore how the constitutional rights which people have might cause us to reflect in a different way upon these budget decisions.
Isn't there too big a gap between our constitutional vision and our means as a people, our resources as a country?
I mean, we have to ask, can we afford the Constitution? We have to, every budget gives us an opportunity to take a step forward. It doesn't matter how big a crisis you're in, the budget decisions that you make, the political kind of work that goes into that, and even the theoretical work that goes into that. Every time you pass the budget, you have an opportunity to make key choices about taxes and about spending, and about where the benefits and burden of society are going to fall. And we don't think that cutting back on social expenditures is going to bring us any closer to the constitutional vision. We're worried that it's actually going to take us further away. And in the long run, that's not going to help the economy in any way, shape or form.
Isabel, you deal in livelihoods and you are seized with the issue of poverty, which is widespread in our country. What do you think of the mission of Section 27 when it comes to ensuring that we progressively realize the dream of our Constitution?
What Daniel's saying is absolutely correct, and I was at a meeting hosted by the Human Rights Commission today, which was looking exactly at that, at our obligations and our reporting to the United Nations. But we have our own constitution, which we seem to be failing, and we we're not getting that kind of emphasis on the fact that we're not meeting our constitutional obligations. But going back to your question on leadership, it's a good one. It's been troubling me because there is a leadership deficit. I think if you look around the different sectors, the different social actors in South Africa, government, business, labour and community constituency at the NEDLAC process, for instance, what we've developed a methodology of almost trench warfare. So if you come up with a position, then I have a position which basically tries to neutralize yours. So instead of having a positive construct that we build on collectively, the President keeps on calling for a social compact. Many have said that the Constitution itself is that social compact. But when we come together and when our leadership comes together, it's basically neutralizing everybody out. And I think that that is what we're lacking at this point in time, as you said. And so if we're calling on people to make sacrifices, I think
If you were to describe an economic future for this country, what would you say its main characteristics ought to be?
I think that we need to look at employing people. I think we need to get people into skills and we need to get people into income. And if that is linked from social security, linking to skills transfers, and looking at the SETAs and how those can come into a kind of partnership that enables people to be employable, that would be first and foremost. I think dedicating sufficient resources to that will necessarily have to reduce the inequality. But I think unless we are a country at work, we'll not be a working country.
Absolutely.
Jobs, jobs, jobs and justice. Thank you very much for watching. And from Nana and myself, it's good night. Khonandin Mawit.
Oh,